Welcome to Midweek Reflections. My name's Joe. I'm here with Carel, one of the pastors at St. Peter's. This morning we're going to be going through Psalm 46. So why don't you take this time to turn there, read through it, and then we're going to get stuck in with this video. We live in a unique time in South Africa, a different time. There's a lot of struggles going on now at the moment. One of the most recent ones being COVID-19, which has just sent our country into a 21-day lockdown. It's weird because reading about dark times in history is one thing, but living it and living in it is another. Kind of reminds me of what Frodo said to Gandalf in Lord of the Rings when he turned to him and said, "I wish it need not have happened in my time." Yet Gandalf's reply to him was, "So do I, and so do all who live to see such times, but that is not for them to decide. All we have to decide is what to do with the time that is given us." See, almost like a boat has no control over the ocean that it sails on, we have no control of the things that happen around us. All we have control over is how we respond to them. So, Carel, how do you think, as one of the pastors here at St. Peter's, how do you think we should respond to the times that we are in now during this COVID-19 crisis?
Normally what I do is basically go to the past and see how Christians responded to times of crisis and basically do what they've done in the past. For example, like Athanasius, he was an early church father from the 4th century. And just to give you an idea, during his time as a leader of the church, he spent 17 years of his life in exile. I mean, that's a bit longer than a 21-day lockdown.
Yeah.
You also, for example, like Augustine, he lived during the time of the fall of Rome in 410 AD and then the eventual collapse of the entire Western Empire. I mean, how did he respond to that? Or Martin Luther in 1527, the Black Plague, which claimed a quarter of Europe's population, reached his town in Wittenberg. I mean, how did he respond to that? And what you'll find interesting is with all of them, one thing they all have in common is that they responded by going to the Psalms.
So then, why would you apply Psalm 46 to us? Why would we reflect on it as St. Peter's Church?
Well, we're going to delve into it. And I mean, looking at those portrait art galleries, I hope you have your Bible open that you can see them. And hopefully you see as we look at each one and how they're hung up by the psalm that you'd see the beauty of the psalm and why it's an encouragement. But there are 3 portraits in the psalm. The first portrait you see in verses 2 to 3. The second portrait you see in verses 4 to 6. And the third portrait you see in verses 8 to 10. But then interspersed is verse 1, verse 7, verse 11, which is a refrain, a type of concluding theme, which starts there, it ends there. Basically what we need to see and how we need to feel, how we need to respond when we look at these portraits. Let's look at the first portrait, portrait 1, which you see in verses 2 to 3. And it's quite a phenomenal picture. It's what we actually see here is creation unraveling. I mean, when you go look at it, the psalmist begins, of course, in verse 1 with this beautiful statement that God is our refuge and strength, the ever-present help in trouble. That's very encouraging. But what follows is actually quite dramatic, is the description of verses 2 to 3. Because look what he's describing here. God is our refuge and strength, ever-present help in trouble. Therefore we will not fear what? Look at this. Though the earth give way and the mountains fall into the heart of the sea, though its waters roar and foam and mountains quake with their surging. Now you just got to think about that for a moment. What he is describing here is actually like creation unraveling. It's creation undone. It's the opposite. If you go read Genesis 1, it's the opposite of Genesis 1, where basically everything is just going back to chaos. It's like Genesis chapter 6 with a great flood. That's what he's describing in verses 2 to 3.
Like as bad as things can get, basically.
Exactly. And he's saying basically, even if such an event should occur again, even if creation should be unraveling at the seams, the world as you know it, falling apart in every single way, he's saying, God is our refuge and strength. We have nothing to fear. And that's the first portrait. But it's from this chaotic scene that we move to the second portrait.
And what's that?
Well, it's a little bit different. It's a bit smaller, but it's just as significant. We see a city under siege in this verbal portrait. Because we have the surging waters in verses 2 to 3, but now the psalmist describes Jerusalem and the temple. When you look at those words in verse 4, I mean, look at this. There is a river whose streams make glad the city of God, the holy place where the Most High dwells. So you have surging, chaotic waters, creation unraveling at the seams. But inside the city of God, where God's presence dwells, there's a beautiful, life-giving stream. It's a massive contrast. And that should make you pause and consider. That's how it's like when you abide in God's presence. And notice the contrast, and notice as well how the city is described. Otherwise, yes, that's what's happening in the city. But then look at verse 6. I mean, it's describing the surrounding world of the city as the nations are in uproar. It's like the surging waters are like the nations raging against God's city, besieging it, trying to overwhelm it. And yet, look at the psalmist's confidence. Because God's presence is with them. Look at verse 5. God is within her. She will not fall. God will help her at the break of day. So he's saying God's abiding presence, this life-giving stream, God being among his people, will ensure that Jerusalem will not fall, that God will be their refuge and strength in this time of siege.
I think I'm just wondering, how does it apply in reality or in historical stories in the Bible?
Go explore the psalm. See how the psalm actually relates to the following passages. I mean, the first was just see how God delivers Israel from Pharaoh in Exodus 14. Notice particularly verses 27 to 28, very similar language to this psalm. But also see how God delivers Jerusalem from the armies of Assyria, besieging Jerusalem, in Isaiah 36 to 37. In fact, I would even say that that's probably the historical setting of the psalm, is the Assyrian armies besieging Jerusalem in Isaiah 36 to 37. You'll find it in Kings as well and Chronicles. But I'd just say that's a beautiful place to see how this plays out. But then, of course, for us who are Christians, as you journey through the Bible, see how God delivers Jesus, the Messiah, from death. And if you want to see that, go to Acts chapter 2, verse 22 to 36. Because when you think about it, isn't death the unraveling of creation? Isn't death the ultimate enemy, bringing everything to a state of non-being?
Yeah.
And so there we see God's ultimate deliverance of his Messiah, Jesus. And so that's where you see the psalm really come to its fullness.
I will definitely go do that, Carl. And I'm sure our viewers at home will do that as well.
Oh, you're Joe. Please do.
Yeah. But our portraits don't end at portrait 2. Hey, we still have one more to get to.
Yeah. And before we get there, you'll see verse 7
Yeah.
and 11. Could you maybe just read verse 7 and 11 for us? There's a repetition here in the psalm.
The Lord Almighty is with us. The God of Jacob is our fortress.
That's sort of what we need to keep on concluding as we look at these images. Whether creation's unraveling or there's a siege going on, like what we're experiencing now, he's saying, look, God's presence is our high place. It's our impenetrable stronghold. He's our safe house. And we find refuge in him in all these times. That's sort of the concluding refrain. But before he concludes it again in verse 11, in between verse 7 and 11, is this last portrait. And this is quite a beautiful one, because what you see here is actually the end of turmoil, the end of war. Because we have the surging waters in verses 2 to 3. We have the city under siege in verses 4 to 6. And the psalmist is saying, God's not just going to deliver us from these. He's going to actually act to end all of them, to make an end. God will quiet the raging waters that threaten to swallow the mountains. God's going to silence the nations that are in uproar. See what he says in verse 9. He will make wars cease to the ends of the earth. He breaks the bow, shatters the spear. He burns the shields with fire. It's basically this picture of God just decimating all opposition, silencing them before him. All this turmoil just quieted. Like God commanded creation in Genesis 1, like Jesus commanded the raging storm, and it just became a placid lake, so God will command the nations. Look at verse 10. Be still and know that I am God. I'll be exalted among the nations. I'll be exalted in the earth. And he's saying at that moment, when God silences his opposition, silences the turmoil and the chaos, only God's name will be exalted. Only God will be revered.
Like in the Lord's Prayer, how we pray, Father in heaven, hallowed be your name, your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. That example of hallowing and exalting his name.
Yeah, and what you're actually seeing in verses 8 to 10 is the full realization of that prayer. God alone will be exalted. Everything will be still before him. And in many ways, you see that in those biblical stories. I mean, Pharaoh was silenced before God. The Assyrian army was silenced before God. And those were just glimmers of the day when Christ will return, the Messiah will return, and silence all opposition. Like in Philippians chapter 2, verse 8 to 11. Every knee will bow, every tongue will confess that Jesus Christ is Lord. As we end, I mean, we talked about Luther at the beginning. Let's bring him back here, and I want to leave you with this, because in 1527, when the Black Plague hit Wittenberg, and a lot of people were fleeing, Luther decided to stay, and he opened up his home to care for the sick and dying. But you can imagine that put a lot of strain on his family. He almost lost his son. He became himself quite ill in many respects, and on many occasions during this time, the psalm he would go to find encouragement was Psalm 46. He would read it, he would meditate on it, he would sing it. For example, with his co-worker Philip Melanchthon, when he felt particularly discouraged, he would say, "Come, Philip, let's sing the 46th Psalm." And after this period, finding strength and encouragement from the psalm, he actually then wrote a hymn. He put words, his experiences basically, on paper. And you might know this hymn. It's a very well-known hymn. It's a famous hymn. It's this one: "A mighty fortress is our God, a bulwark never failing." And what you need to realize is Luther didn't just teach the psalm, he lived it. And that's hymn is born out of a life experience of struggle with the epidemic plague, and later on future struggles that Luther would have. And so I thought it would be quite cool if, Joe, you could end this video just reading that hymn for us.
Yeah. A mighty fortress is our God, a bulwark never failing, our helper here amid the flood of mortal ills prevailing. For still our ancient foe doth seek to work us woe. His craft and power are great, and armed with cruel hate. On earth is not his equal. Did we in our own strength confide, our striving would be losing. Were not the right man on our side, the man of God's own choosing. Dost ask who that may be? Christ Jesus, it is he. Lord Sabbath his name, from age to age the same. He must win the battle. And though this world with devils filled should threaten to undo us, we will not fear, for God hath willed his truth to triumph through us. The prince of darkness grim, we tremble not for him. His rage we can endure, but for lo, his doom is sure. One little word shall fell him. That word above all earthly powers, no thanks to them abideth. The spirit and the gifts are ours, through him who with us sideth. Let goods and kindred go, this mortal life also. The body they may kill, God's truth abideth still. His kingdom is forever.